the life of David tonight. Start on it. It'll take a few weeks. I'm not going to ask you about what you should have read yet, but we're going to get to it. So I want to talk a little bit about David in general, things that we'll study more as we go on with our studies. You know, he's a most versatile man. Have you ever heard the term a Renaissance man? Somebody who could do all kinds of things. When he was a young guy, he was very athletic. You know, there's all kinds of stories about him killing bears and all this good stuff. And he was also a musician. He was called the king to come and play for him when the king got all depressed and in a bad space. We obviously know he was a poet because he wrote many of the Psalms. He also was a very strong general and led a lot of battles and campaigns. He was even thought to be better at it than the king at that time. And most people consider him to be the greatest king of Israel. Now, if you've never studied the Old Testament, Israel had many, many kings. They had many kings. Saul started out as the first one, and then David, and then Solomon. And from then on, it was just name after name. And I took an Old Testament course, and you forever had to remember all these folks. And they would just be good, and they'd do bad. And they'd be good, and they'd be bad. They'd be good, and they'd be bad. And we had a test in Old Testament class one time, and he asked something about one of the kings. And I saw one of my friends chuckling as she wrote. And it was, what did King so-and-so do? And she was so disgusted with all these kings, she said, he built tennis courts and paved the streets. The teacher thought it was funny. So we see the versatility of him, and hopefully when we go through some of these chapters, we're going to see more about him than just the key stories that we know. He has some great weaknesses, and he has some strengths. And we'll be talking about those along the way, because one of the reasons I believe we know so much about David's life in the scripture is to show us that you can have some strengths and you can have some weaknesses. You can be doing really well in one area and, mess up really bad too. And yet in the midst of all that, David was called the apple of God's eye. So I ask you to read chapters 15, 16 in 1 Samuel, not just the verses. And I'm not going to ask you if you read it, but if you did anything stand out to you, or did you notice anything, or did anything cross your mind?
Yeah, all the people killing.
Yep, all the people killing. You know, that's one of the things that make people go, what kind of God is that?
Not him,
but you know, sometimes I think God gets a bad rap. And this time, if something happened bad or good, they want to attribute it to God. And sometimes it just happened, or people just did things. I had a text message on Facebook to somebody else, but I saw it. This person's been going through a lot of illness, and somebody said, I'm sorry for all these horrible things the devil is putting on your life. And it just doesn't agree with my theology real well. What else? What else did you find in these two chapters?
the size of the arm. Yeah. But I didn't know there were that many people back then.
Didn't know there were that many people back then. Well, you have to understand.
I didn't think I could read. I was thinking, 2000 to start off.
Yeah.
I'm like, what?
Right. And you have to realize, though, that just like today in Israel, every young person has to put in 2 years of service. That didn't just start this year. That didn't just start during our time. At that time, almost all of the men were expected to be in the army for a period of time. Makes it a little larger that way. All right, let's look at some of this. Chapter 15. I'm going to read for a little bit, verses 1 through 9. The message. Samuel said to Saul, God sent me to anoint you king over his people Israel. Now listen again to what God says. This is the God of the angel army speaking. I'm about to get even with Amalek for ambushing Israel when Israel came up out of Egypt. Kind of holding a grudge for a long time here, okay? Like hundreds of years. I'm about to get even with Amalek for ambushing Israel. Here's what you're to do. Now Now notice the specifics. Go to war against Amalek, put everything connected with Amalek under a holy ban, no exceptions. This is to be a total destruction, men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys, the works. Saul called the army together at Telem. If you're reading this, you don't know how to pronounce these words, don't worry about it. Nobody's going to ask you to be on Jeopardy and say it or spell it right. Prepare to go to war. 200 companies of infantry from Israel and another 10 companies from Judah. Saul marched to Amalek City and hid in the canyon. Then Saul got word to the Kenites, get out of here while you can, evacuate the city right now or you'll be lumped in with the Amalekites. I'm warning you because you showed real kindness to the Israelites when they came up out of Egypt. And they did. The Kenites evacuated the place. Then Saul went after Amalek from the canyon all the way to Shur, near the Egyptian border. He captured Agag, I always thought that was a funny name, a king of Amalek, alive. Everyone else was killed under the terms of the holy ban. Saul and the army made an exception for Agag, and for the choice sheep and cattle, they didn't include them under the terms of the holy ban. But all the rest, which nobody wanted anyway, they destroyed as decreed by the holy ban. All right, now I have trouble too with all these people getting killed. But what did God say Saul was supposed to do?
Kill everything.
Let me phrase that. What did Samuel say God said? Kill everybody. What did Saul do? He kept the king, the leader, and he kept the choice, the best animals. Was God specific in what he asked Saul to do?
Very specific.
Very specific. Everywhere. But Saul didn't do that. Why did he not do that?
He wanted the fat cows and
Sure. He wanted those for his.
Yeah.
He wanted for his country. Why did he keep that king, though? I mean, who would want to keep a king named Agag anyhow? But anyhow, why didn't he kill the king too?
probably to lord over him,
To show off, to perhaps have him have to see, Agag have to see the destruction of everything he had. Doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? Verse 10 to 11, NIV. Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel. I'm grieved that I've made Saul king because he has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. Samuel was troubled and he cried out to the Lord all that night. Okay, now Samuel's the priest that anointed Saul king because God told him to. I don't think God ever intended Israel to have kings, but everybody else had one, so they wanted one. It was supposed to be a theocracy. God was supposed to be the head of their country. So Saul had gone, he got in Samuel. Samuel had gone, he got in Saul to be king. And God says he has messed up royally. He has messed up royally. I'm aggrieved. I'm sad that I made him. And actually the word there almost has an angry tone to it. So if that's the case, why was Samuel so troubled he cried all night? There's no right or wrong answer.
I wonder if part of it might be that Samuel was the vessel for the anointing. It was like from, we say from God's, whatever to our ears, God's lips to ours. I wonder if Samuel, as that priest, wasn't the go-between from God to Saul. And he was a major player in this, whether...
He had a lot invested in this. Perhaps he felt like he had failed in some way. When you nurture or lead or help somebody and then they mess up, it's really natural to think, oh, what else should I have done? What else could I have done? Someone read, please, verses 12 through just 12 and 13.
Okay. Early in the morning, Samuel got up and went to meet Saul, but he was told, Saul has gone to Carmel. There he has set up a monument in his own honor and has turned and gone on down to Gilgal.
Mm-hmm.
When Samuel reached him, Saul said, "The Lord bless you, I have carried out the Lord's instructions."
2 verses just so full of stuff. Okay, now, and again, you may not know what the importance of this is. Samuel gets this message from God. He's upset with Saul. Samuel goes to see Saul. It must be a tongue twister. Samuel goes to see Saul, and he finds out Saul's not where he's supposed to be. Okay, so he's gone down to Carmel. What's the big deal? Carmel was a place where other faiths worshipped and had altars. And not only had he gone down there, but he hadn't even gone to worship another god. Why had he gone down there?
To throw himself a victory party.
To throw himself a victory party, to make a monument to himself. Who gave him the directions about what to do? Samuel, but before that, God. So he goes and makes a statue for himself. I'm not going to get political, but that sounds awfully familiar. And so, now when Samuel shows up, okay, now the priest is showing up. Saul has to know his heart of hearts. He didn't do what God said. The priest shows up, and Saul rushes out and says, "What a good boy am I. I did what God said." That's not message, that's Catherine. "The Lord bless you. I've carried out the Lord's instructions." Why in the world would he do that?
Delusional? Delusional?
Delusional.
Narcissistic?
You know, part of it I think Saul really thought Saul had done what God had said. Because he'd gotten rid of all these bad people, except for King Agag and all the animals. You know, not even all the animals, just the sheep and the goats, the sheep and the cattle. Can't you just see him going out there all excited? And then Samuel's so funny, he says, "Don't I hear sheep somewhere?" Is that a mooing sound? Don't I hear sheep? Wouldn't you love to have seen Saul's face right that minute? You know, I just think there's so much funny stuff, humor. Sad. And then to Saul, what did he say?
And Saul said, "Fake news."
Yeah, fake news. Okay, so then what does Saul say about these bleeding sheep? Does he say they were really good, Samuel, and I thought they'd be good for sacrifice, and I just really had to bring them back to show you how good they were? Is that what he said? No, he says my soldiers did it. I didn't do it. I didn't do, you know, they just didn't understand. They just really, verse 15, they brought them, they spared the best of the sheep and the cattle to sacrifice to the Lord, your God, but we totally destroyed the rest. I don't think so.
And it's interesting, he said the Lord your God, not the Lord.
Yeah, not the Lord our God. Yeah. Tries to convince him that he did obey. And then Samuel. Now understand how brave this is of Samuel. This is not like me coming to you and saying, you know, Rhonda, I know you had planned to do this and you've really messed up and you've got to do something different. You can't do this anymore. This was a whole different thing because Samuel was saying this to whom? The king. And for years and years and thousands of years, when you confront the king or you talk bad to the king, what happens?
Cut your head off.
You die. You die. So understand Samuel's commitment to what God had called him to do this. "Stop," Samuel said to Saul, 16. "Let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night." And good old gullible Saul. Okay, tell me. "Although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel. The Lord sent you on a mission saying, go, and da-da-da-da-da, we already know the orders. Why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eyes of God?" Just calling him on it. And Saul says, "But I did obey the Lord. I went on the mission the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed. The soldiers took sheep and cattle from the plunder, the best of what was devoted to God, in order to sacrifice them. Now, if he's going to sacrifice them, why is he at this other place? If he's going to sacrifice them, he'd stayed near the altar. And Samuel just doesn't buy it. Switching back over to the message. Do you think all God wants are sacrifices? Empty rituals just for show? God wants you to listen to God. Plain listening is the thing, not staging a lavish religious production. Not doing what God tells you is far worse than fooling around in the occult. Getting self-important around God is far worse than making deals with your dead ancestors. Because you said no to God's command, God says no to your kingship. Whew. Whoa. Let's play angel advocate for a minute. Saul almost did everything God said. Saul was very tickled in himself because God had anointed him the king. Saul even went out to do a celebration, and he thought that was okay. What does that do today? How do we today take what God's telling us to do and try to stretch it into something else? Because these stories aren't here just to be funny. I think sometimes in some churches we think if we make it big enough and loud enough, and there may be no meat to what's being taught. For some of us, we may think, okay, I came to church, and I even put something in that plate when it came around, and yeah, I took the communion. I'm good for a week. I just wonder if there's a connection there. So he's been rejected as king. Don't you wonder what Saul thought right then? Do you think he believed Samuel? Did he stop being king? If you read the next chapter, did he stop being king right that minute? No, he's still the king. That silly old priest, Samuel, said I was done for, but I'm still getting a paycheck. The keys still work in the palace. The soldiers still obey me. Saul gave in and confessed, I've sinned. I love this in the message. I've sinned and I've trampled roughshod over God's word and your instructions. I cared more about pleasing the people. I let them tell me what to do. He's still blaming all those soldiers. Oh, absolve me of my sin. Take my hand and lead me to the altar so I can worship God. Now notice that there's a word missing there that was in the other time when he talked about the Lord. He didn't say, so I can go worship your Lord. He says, so I can go worship the Lord. Maybe this reproach helped a little bit. Someone read 27 and through 29.
As Samuel turned to leave, Saul grabbed at his priestly robe and a piece tore off. Samuel said, God has just now torn the kingdom from you and handed it over to your neighbor, a better man than you are. Israel's God of glory doesn't deceive, and he doesn't dither. He says what he means, and he means what he says.
NIV says, God is not a man that he should change his mind. I love the pictures. He didn't just turn around to him and say that, but when he ripped the robe, he said, you have distanced yourself. You've been cut off. And again, the punishment, if you want, doesn't happen immediately. I don't know about you, but when I do things I know are not right, sometimes it bites me right then. But there's other times it comes back to you later. I see some heads nodding. Saul tries again. I've sinned. Don't abandon me. Support me with your presence before the leaders and the people. Come alongside of me so I can go back and worship God. The next verse, two words in the message says, Samuel did. He went back with him, went on his knees before God, and worshipped. Why did Samuel do this?
Because he was afraid of losing what he had.
Okay. Samuel may be afraid of losing.
Oh, wait a minute, I was thinking
Talking
Saul.
Yeah.
Oops, wrong
But
person.
why did Samuel go back with him? He just said, you know, you really messed up. Why did he go back with him?
I would think he believed in redemption.
Maybe he was believing and hoping for redemption. I think we go back to that thing of, well, he's the one God had me pick. I'm kind of responsible for him. And it could have been that he hoped that in going back to do what he was supposed to do, that would have turned Saul around. I was talking to Joanna the other night about someone that some of us used to be good friends with, and they're pretty ill now. And I said to Joanna, if that person called me and said, I want you to come pray with me. I want you to come visit me. I said, I'd go. And Joanna said, you would? And I said, yeah, because I once was that person's pastor, and in my mind, I always had that connection. Now, I hope that I'd have a good, clear mind and a clear conscience when I went. But I think Samuel was trying to help with some redemption there for sure. Skip on down to 34. Samuel left immediately for Ramah, which is where the altar was. And Saul went home to Gibeon. Samuel had nothing to do with Saul from then on, though he grieved long and deeply over him. But God was sorry God had ever made Saul king in the first place. Samuel had nothing to do with Saul from that point on. Now, that meant that Saul was without a pastor. Saul was without a priest. Saul was without a spiritual director. Let's look at 16 just real quickly. This is about the calling or the anointing of David. Really cool story. And I'll kind of do the end before the middle or the beginning. The cool thing is God leads Samuel to anoint David as the next king. Where was David when he got called in to be anointed? He was out in the field with the sheep. He was doing his job. And why was he the one out in the field when everybody else was there at the house? Because he was the runt, the message says. He was the youngest. Now, okay, so he comes in from the field and, you know, he gets anointed to be king, and then do they immediately put a crown on him? No. No, once again, what God has put into motion, what's the matter? What God has put into motion is going to take years to come to fruition. God of the in-between times. Look at the story just real quickly. So God tells Samuel to go down to this Jesse's family who happened to live in Bethlehem. Story connecting all through here. And he tells him to take a heifer with you to say, I'm coming to lead worship, so that Saul wouldn't get hint of what was going on. He was going out to a little family visit, a little visitation. Now what's interesting to me is in verse 4, Samuel goes, he takes this heifer with him, and the town fathers come out, and they say, is there something wrong? Do you come in peace? I don't know about you, and I don't think you would do this to me, but I can remember at my house growing up, if I heard, and I looked out the door and it was the preacher, I was in trouble. He came to my house lots trying to get me to get baptized. I remember that specifically. But can you imagine you're standing at the mall talking, and suddenly your pastor walks up. And sometimes, I don't think you'd have a problem with me being there, and suddenly you might go, oh, what's in my grocery cart? You know, that kind of thing. And so they were concerned because the priest, especially Samuel, just didn't go out on visitation. If he showed up, something special was happening. And he kind of keeps this cover story going. No, I'm just here to make a little sacrifice and, you know, visit with Jesse and his family. So Jesse brings his sons in verse 6. When they arrived, Samuel took one look at Eliab and thought, here he is, God's anointed. Yep, that's That's the one. And God says, looks aren't everything. Don't be impressed with his looks and stature. I've already eliminated him. Doesn't it sound like the Bachelor thing, you know?
Yeah.
I've already eliminated him, or Dancing with the Stars. God judges people differently than humans do. Men and women look at the face. God looks at the heart. Isn't it interesting that Samuel, as close to God as Samuel had been since he was a little boy, if you remember the story, he still was going on looks. Now, there's nothing wrong with people being good looking, but he didn't know this young man, but he thought he looked like. In one of the elections several years back, I asked my mother who she was voting for, and she said, that one with the suit that looks like a president. Now, it was somebody who didn't even make it to the nominations during the primaries. And I thought of that. She's voting on him because he looks like a president. And I've seen that happen before. Somebody will come in, especially in MCCs. In the past, if somebody came in and they had on a suit and tie and a black Bible, I often would think it was a pastor from somewhere coming to check us out. More times than not, it was a church member from somewhere else who was looking for a place to be where he was more accepted. So they call up all these other kids. Not him, not him, not him, not that one either. And Samuel was blunt with Jesse. Verse 10, God hasn't chosen any of these. None of them yet. Don't you have anybody else? Aren't there any more sons? And in the Message, verse 11, well, yeah, there's a runt, but he's out tending the sheep. Samuel ordered Jesse, go get him, and we're not moving from this spot until he's here. Well, nobody wanted the priest, Samuel, hanging out and being upset with you. Jesse sent for him. He was brought in, the very picture of health, bright-eyed and good-looking. God said, up on your feet, anoint him. This is the one. Again, picture, Sophia, picture this. Kid comes in out of the field. He's a good-looking kid. But if he's the runt, imagine what the others, how big the others must have been. And then God says, yep, that's the one. Get up and anoint him. I don't know about you, but most of us would have gone, are you sure, God? Are you sure? Maybe Jesse hasn't had a son yet that's supposed to be the king. Samuel took his flask of oil and anointed him, with his brothers standing around watching the Spirit of God enter David like a rush of wind, God vitally empowering him for the rest of his life. They could visibly see a change. Visibly see a change. And he was going to have that spirit, that anointing for the rest of his life. Samuel left and went home to Ramah. Samuel said, I've done what I'm supposed to do. Let's get on back. What happens next?
Saul gets skirt. Saul gets skirt.
Saul gets scared. Because I get the picture that if you'd had a split screen TV, as that spirit came into David, it left out Saul. That anointing, that presence. And he was terrified. I don't know if you've ever had an experience in your life of feeling like God had left you. Feeling like you'd lost that connection. I know the few times it's happened in my life, that's not been a pleasant feeling. It's not been something I want to go and celebrate. It's not something I won't even think that I'm in that place. But he was terrified because he'd been close enough to know the difference. Like Sunday, I was talking about the best spiritual times and the hardest spiritual times. You know the difference. The Message Bible calls it an awful, tormenting depression, making your life miserable. And they try to find something that's going to make him feel better. What do they find? A harp player, some music that would calm him down. Look at verse 18, how they're describing. And it doesn't say his name. One of his associates said, you know, I've seen this kid, this guy, this person, this young person. I've seen him myself. He's a brave man and a warrior. He speaks well, is a fine-looking man, and the Lord is with him. Why would he use these words to describe David to Saul?
He's pretending like he doesn't. He's pretending like he doesn't know more.
Okay, and maybe he does or doesn't know more.
Isn't that what humans look for?
What humans would look for. He would fit in at the temple, at the palace. The kid out in the field with the sheep probably would not be ushered into the palace. And he's got a good reputation. That's another thing. A question I came up with is, what is David doing with that experience of being told he'd be the next king? Is he freaking out? Did he just kind of like put it aside? You know, that was just that old man Samuel who knows what he's talking about. And Mary, remember Mary, Jesus, birth of Jesus, said she kept these things and pondered them in her heart. Sometimes you know that God is going to do something with you in the future. And you may not even know what it is, but you know it's coming. And you may not be able to tell, just like Rhonda can't tell us the details, but she will eventually.
Yes.
You may not be able to tell everybody what it is, but you know there's something in there. So Saul sends messengers to Jesse requesting, send your son David to me, the one who tends the sheep. You just can't get rid of that reputation, huh? Now, Jesse didn't just send the boy up there. Why does he do the preparation that says, verses 20 and 21? Anybody?
Hallelujah. Jesse took a donkey loaded with bread, a skin of wine, and a kid, sent them by his son David to Saul. And David came to Saul and entered his service. Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer.
Okay. Now, he didn't send a child with him. That's a word for a baby goat, okay? He sent a kid with him. The king has just asked for David to come. Why did he send all this other stuff?
You don't show up empty-handed.
You don't show up empty-handed. You don't show up empty-handed. It was almost a dowry, if you will. It was things that would make the king happy. So he sends back and says, it's going to be one of Saul's armor bearers. I don't know if that's a term you know. It's not just perhaps carrying his armor, but an armor bearer is also someone who helps and assists. A lot of African American churches, there will be someone called an armor bearer that assists the pastor, especially on Sundays. There's a pastor in Charlotte, another church, on MCC, and she has armor bearers. And when she comes into the church, they carry her Bible. They carry her bottle of water. They walk up and make sure she's seated and comfortable. When she gets ready to get up and preach, they stand up and escort her to the altar, to the pulpit. And they're her armor bearers. First time I saw that, I'm carrying my own water. I'm carrying my own Bible. But that's a part of their honoring the role of her as their pastor. Verse 22, Saul sent word to Jesse, allow David to remain in my service, for I am pleased with him. I am pleased with him. Saul doesn't have a clue who he's just invited into the palace. Saul doesn't understand that he is now training the next king. I'm sure David just watched and listened all he could. Whenever the Spirit from God came upon Saul, David would take his harp and play, then relief would come to Saul and he would feel better, and the evil spirit would leave him. The message it calls his moodiness. So David gets to see Saul at his absolute worst times. In fact, that's when he sees him most. Although I think he probably had David around. David was a good-looking boy. I think Saul probably enjoyed having him in his court, if you will. The story's going to take a little bit different turn when we look at the next few chapters. One of the next stories you're going to run into in chapter 17 is a story you've heard all your life if you ever were in Sunday school. David and Goliath. My challenge to you, especially around that story, is find something you didn't see, know, or realize. Now, I've always thought in my mind, you know how you picture in your mind David and Goliath? One of the coolest things I ever did one time was I had a little kid, much younger than Trips, about 5 years old, and one of the other kids had brought in their football stuff. We had the little 5-year kid sit up, and we put a helmet on him, and we put the shoulder pads on him, and some other stuff. You know, you just get this idea of how overwhelmed he was. But just to give you something to think about from various studies I did, it's thought that Goliath was perhaps 9 foot 9 inches tall, depending on how you measure a cubit. His armor was estimated to weigh 78 pounds. His spear would have been 26 feet long. And the head of that spear would have been about 17 to 20 pounds. You think about how David was described, especially remember he was the runt. I've never pictured David as a big, robust person. You think about that giant he's going up against. What's the biggest giant? Be thinking for next week too about what's the biggest giant you're facing. What's the biggest Goliath haunting you? What's the biggest Goliath that you may have to deal with in the coming week? Okay. Did you learn anything about David tonight you didn't know before?
I didn't know that he used to kill lions and bears when he was out in the field.
Well, somebody had to.
What's his job?
Yeah, but I mean, I just
Yeah.
didn't.
Uh-huh.
I didn't
There's
know that
an
he
account
did.
of it in one of the places.
I didn't know he took care of sheep.
Okay, we took care of sheep. Yeah, I love the fact, I told you Sunday, I love the fact that I can be reading and studying and find something, and I also, sometimes I've honestly looked, somebody put a new paragraph in here. They put a new paragraph in here. Any last minute prayer requests or praises?
A praise. I read an article in the newspaper about a local church where they had 3 tiers of heaven, and to get to the top tier, it would have to be a man and wife getting, a man and woman getting married. You had to be a man and a woman, and you had to be married. And my praise after reading that is I'm glad I'm here, because that was unbelievable reading that.
And the things people have come up with and what you have to do to get to the best part of heaven.
But 3 tiers of heaven?
I guess you better be glad you can at least get in the first one, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it, you know, again, all of us in this room have been at MCC long enough that sometimes we forget what a unique place it is to be. Prayer. The woman that I'm hoping will come, her name is Martha. Loving God, we thank you tonight for your blessings. We thank you for the example of Samuel being faithful to go and do, even in fear of life, what you asked him to do. We thank you for Jesse having that one more son. Give us the courage to know that there are no Goliaths in our life that you can't help us conquer. In your name we pray. Amen.